So what we're going to do is just kind of have a little bit of an open dialogue around approved therapies. We want this also to be an open discussion with all of you. So we have some questions for the panelists to get us started, and then we're going to open it up so you can, come to the mics, ask questions, and we'll hopefully have a good discussion. And so I think we have a slide that we could pull up that has just kind of the list. So I'm going to be at the podium, so you go wherever, yeah. This is just a reference for all of the approved therapies that we currently have in the US for Duchenne. There's a lot of information as well in that bag that you received with conference. A lot of the companies have information that's put in there. There's a lot of information on the website as well for reference. We'll kind of quickly go through all of these and then introduce our panelists. So we talked a little bit in the gene therapy session yesterday about Elevidys. That's the gene therapy delivering, using an AAV to deliver a microdystrophin, ages 4 years and up. There is some genetic restrictions there. Patients that have deletions in exons 8 or 9, not able to receive that therapy, and it is a one-time IV infusion. The next 4 drugs in that list are our exon skipping products. And so we have a session this afternoon where we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the investigational products that are being developed that are also exon skipping. But these are mutation-specific products, so you do have to have a certain genetic variant to be able to potentially receive these therapies. And the idea here is that it can help restore the production of some of that missing dystrophin protein in your muscles. And these are currently the approved products done through weekly IV infusion. And then, of course, we have steroids. So I think everyone's familiar. We don't, prednisone is not one that's listed up here, but in addition to something like prednisone, we have Agamree and Emflaza. Agamree is our most recent kind of approved steroid in this group. Some different routes of administration here. And then lastly, we have Duvizat, which again, one of our more recently approved therapies. It's a small molecule inhibitor, inhibits an enzyme called HDAC. And by helping to reduce some inflammation, it can help protect the muscle, help promote muscle regeneration. So this is a therapy just for patients 6 years and up, taken twice daily. But that's a little bit of background. Again, more information in your booklets on a lot of these therapies. So I'm just going to start down the line here. Can you just give me a quick introduction of your name, institution, and then your specialty?
Sure. Hi, guys. My name is Aravindhan, or Panda. I'm a neurologist at Arkansas Children's Hospital.
Good morning. My name is Leigh Ramos-Platt. I am one of the neurologists at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, University of Southern California.
I'm Sam Mackenzie. I'm a pediatric neurologist, neuromuscular medicine at University of Rochester.
Larry Markham. I'm not a neurologist. I'm a cardiologist at Riley Children's in Indianapolis.
All right, so I think where we wanted to start, and we heard a little bit about this, I think, in the session last night about making decisions that are right for you, which is for our panelists, when families come to you to explore what is, a growing kind of pipeline of potentially approved therapies, where do you kind of start in those conversations? And for the audience, or the members of the audience who maybe don't know, are there kind of recommendations about how they maybe should engage their care team about starting to decide, is a gene therapy right for me? Is an exon skipping therapy right for me? Should I go after something like Duvizat? Which steroids? So how do you kind of start those conversations? I was going to say, whichever one can jump in.
I can start. I think it's a lot, right, to go through the whole thing in a tight day with one person. So how the discussion that I start usually with is first to start from the basics, right? Do we actually understand what's going on? What's this is? What is DMD? What are the how the genetics of it, and explaining just the basics and how is this going to look. I want to make sure we understand that first. And then you get into this whole therapies options and introducing one of them, each one of them. It takes a long time, so I may just split them into a couple of. If they're newly diagnosed, right? Sometimes we split them into a couple of visits. Like we just first talk about what it is, because you can easily talk to them for about a couple hours and just keep going on. But it doesn't stay. You probably get maybe 1% of it, 2% of what I've discussed that you get it, right? So then we usually try to, the new diagnosis, newly diagnosed families, we try to split them in a couple of visits. So we'll set up another telemedicine, or we'll come back, we'll talk about options, and next time, what are the treatment options and the clinical trial options. So it's a long discussion. I think one of the things that I emphasize is, yes, we have a lot of therapies. Like I said in my session yesterday, I think corticosteroids are still the mainstay of treatment. We talk about that, the pros and cons, the different options, and if we want to start that out first, I think that is the basic thing that they established. We talk about that, and then I go on to the other options.
I agree with Dr. Panda. I think it's important to understand the basics of Duchenne and why different types of treatments will work in different areas of the disorder. And when a patient comes in to talk about the different treatment options, it also depends how that conversation goes, whether or not they're coming from a different center, if they're newly diagnosed, or if they're one of our own. And we have to get a sense of the patients, their families, of what treatment would be best for them. We really try to not persuade a family for what we think is necessarily the best option for them. While I think our input is important, I think even more important is the input coming from the family. When we're making decisions, this is a partnership between us, your child, or the patient, and the family.
One other thing is also depending on where you practice, the social factors, the cultural factors, your cultural beliefs, those come into play also in making these decisions. I think on our side, it's very important for us to understand that as well when we talk about these options, how we talk about it, how we present that as well.
I think another kind of along the same line of after maybe looking at and kind of starting to think about the therapies, and as a question that we hear a lot, and it even came up, I think, during the gene therapy discussion a little bit, is the idea of combination therapy. And I think for a lot of families, they have potentially multiple options. Some of you, depending on mutation, you might be amenable for a gene therapy and an exon skipping therapy. Some of it might just be the steroid and something like Duvizet, which is mutation agnostic. So how are you all kind of thinking about ordering these therapies, or even as a field, kind of where are we in terms of thinking about this, and how are you all approaching this? Sam?
Sure. I told these guys before we got up here that I was going to make an advertisement for PPMD's initiative, the DCRN, or the Dystrophinopathy Clinical Research Network. And I think this is a perfect case of why we need such an initiative. So we do a pretty good job in this country, I think, of getting drugs through FDA approval from a regulatory standpoint to the phase 3 and through the phase 3. Where I don't think we're doing such a good job is on the real-world data collection. And with the uncertainty that comes with combination treatments that haven't been studied in a clinical trial, the honest answer, Eric, is that we don't have a lot of great data in terms of drug A plus drug B plus drug C and what that looks like long term. So my conversation with parents now is, we review the potential risks and the potential benefits, and we acknowledge that there's sort of a lack of data. And when possible, we always come back to the point that we're not married to a decision, right? So if we start a medication and there are adverse events, we can talk about dose reduction, we can talk about coming off of that. So thankfully, with the exception of our gene therapies, none of these are irreversible. So I think that is an important part of the conversation as well. But it really does underscore the point that we need to work together as a community. There's a lot of great reasons for hope with everything in the pipeline and having so many drugs approved, but we need to start doing a better job of working together and figuring out what's the evidentiary standard that we can work from to create this kind of harmonized standard of care.
I think it is very individualized, right, from one individual to other individual. There's no one size that fits all, It may be one for someone, and then it's different for another kid. So I think it's very individualized. The key factor that I think is important is setting the expectations up front. None of the therapies that we have, yes, we have all these therapies available. They're not cure, right? They're not going to stop the progression. As the ones that we have approved, they're going to slow down the progression of the disease. So what does that mean for your son? I think that's important. That's setting that expectations and goals up front is important. The other thing that's important is we have to acknowledge that there are things that we don't know. We don't know. We will learn as we continue to go. I think from a provider standpoint, if we make that clear up front also and make the family understand that, yes, we can do this, but I don't know what's going to happen, I think it's important being the transparent and having the conversation.
So I would agree with what's been said. I think when I meet a new family or begin a conversation, I really start to develop a relationship with that family. And one of my first goals is to understand their expectations for what we are doing together. And then the second is a sort of group families and individuals into, are you a tortoise or a hare? Meaning some families want to be all in everything right now, and some families need time to absorb and understand and really make decisions in a more methodical manner. And so I think as a care provider who is discussing treatments and options, I need to be in the space where you are and meet you where you are before I start making recommendations. And then I think the next thing that I do is I take a pessimistic side and I say, what is the downside to whatever treatment we're going to embark on? Because if the downside is greater than your expectations for that treatment, then I've done you a disservice by actually even really going down that road, because the chance is higher that I harm you than it is that it meets your expectations.
I do echo that very, very much, because expectation is very important in continuing the care partnership that we have with patients and families. We do know that none of these are cures, and families are well aware this is not a cure. So to go to, for example, givinostat after gene transfer, if that is something that we can do, we will try to do that. If it makes sense, we will try to do that. And then we will fight the insurance companies to make that happen.
No, and I think that's also a really important point that was touched on in there, and again, echoes the conversation that was happening last night, which is that there is not a perfect answer for the families when they're looking at these options, and especially when we don't necessarily have data on how all of these drugs can work together to increase benefits. So, I think there's sometimes pressure from families in terms of, am I doing the right thing? Am I pursuing the right one? And I think it's good to hear as well that there isn't necessarily this is the optimal. We're still learning. We're still trying. And again, when we can, we'll kind of pursue the options as to the best of our ability. And then, of course, we also wanted to touch on thinking about approaches to some of these approved therapies as patients age. So a lot of the data that was collected on these therapies were done in trials where there were, ambulatory patients. We maybe don't have as much robust data on non-ambulatory, or even thinking about them in terms of potential cardiac implications. So I guess, Larry, maybe I'll start with you as the cardiologist. Where do you kind of start, again, thinking about discussions or monitoring with families as they start to go on some of these approved therapies in older patients?
Yeah, so this gets probably a little bit to the team concept and why I think certified care centers are the ideal place to have these conversations, because most of us work in places or centers where we may not always be in the same space between neurology, cardiology, and pulmonary. We at least meet regularly or have conversations, and some of us are in clinics where you're together during the clinic visit. But I think when I start from my standpoint of saying, what is your opinion, meaning the other team members who are involved with the patient, around this therapy, and what do you think this will do for the patient? Then I look at my own self and I say, okay, have I done everything that either us as a group through Action or other cardiology community, have I done everything that I think we should be doing that most would consider to be standard of care? Okay, you have an 8-year-old who's able to do an MRI, but maybe I haven't done it yet because the patient wasn't ready, or the family really didn't want to start an ACE inhibitor yet, or so I go back to the basics and I say, first, have we done everything that people agree we should have done before we embark on something that we're not sure should be done? And then once I am certain of that, then I can further assess the risk of that potential therapy. And I tend to lean towards being a proponent of discussion, and if the risks, in our opinion, don't outweigh the benefits, I lean towards yes, generally. And so coming at it in that space helps me define what I can do better from a heart management standpoint to mitigate any of the risks that may be possible.
I think, in the rare disease, Duchenne, we are used to accelerated approvals. We're used to extrapolating data towards, let's say, if we only have clinical trial done on 4 to 7-year-old, we're used to extrapolating that information to apply that to younger age group and older boys as well. But I think the key is what medicine they're talking about and the risk versus benefits. I think that is the key, right? For example, if you're asking me to do that, yes, it was only done in ambulatory boys, but would you try that on, the approval is for all, but if you look at the risk versus benefit, I think I would be willing to try that for non-ambulatory, whereas compared to a microdystrophin like Elevidys, it's the data that out there for non-ambulatory boys it's accelerated approval, and we don't have a lot of data yet from that, even though the phase 3 trial is, right now it's in pause. But so I think weighing that, getting that, and then weighing the risk versus benefits is important in making those decisions.
So today, just about an hour ago, Dr. Friedman talked about the importance of community. And community not just for the families, but community for us as care providers as well. So when we are faced in situations where we don't have the data, we do have something else, which is the community of experts that we can rely on. And so when I have a question, hey, can I be doing this? When I don't have that data to back me up, I will go ahead and reach out to Shamindra Connersman, Perry Shea, Craig McDonald, because they are in my state. And we try to talk out, is this the right decision? Can we do this without the data? And we work on our collective experiences to make, hopefully, the best decisions.
Thank you. And then, Larry, one of the things you touched on in terms of talking with families about maybe a little bit of the benefit and risk and understanding, that is, I think, a really important paradigm when considering different approved therapies and kind of expectations. There is a kind of another then layer on top of that, which is for families that maybe are considering investigational trials, there are different requirements where not every trial allows you to be on every approved therapy. We often see exclusions for patients that have received a gene therapy. Sometimes some of the other therapies that are listed here as well can sometimes kind of be excluded. So what do those kind of conversations look like? How do you kind of set expectations for families in terms of maybe what they're interested in, and kind of when you have these available options in front of you and maybe this potential trial that you're looking at?
Yeah, I'll relay a little bit of a story related to a patient who was in an investigational trial that had a lot of restrictions on cardiac medication changes during the duration of the trial. It wasn't a cardiac trial, but medications had to stay the same. They were also approaching an age where I considered the cardiovascular risk was increasing. And so the family was a very proactive family in that if you have a therapy that you think may benefit us, we would rather be on the front end than you tell me, gosh, we missed the boat, we should have done this. And it was really anxiety provoking for me as a provider, because this is what I would have done had this patient not been in a trial. But because they were in a trial, I could not change a dose of a medication, and I could not start a new cardiac medication. Now, the trial was short enough. It was only 2 years, so we really didn't miss any window. But, you know, I had anxieties about, okay, when they come in for their next cardiology visit and their function has tanked, did I miss a window? And so I think individuals who are designing trials really need to take that into account and be in their consciousness of, is the investigational therapeutic, is there crossover with other body systems? And just be cognizant of other body systems may progress during the course of a clinical trial for a skeletal muscle therapy. And we don't want to lock a patient up if there is potential. And so I just go back to that patient because, I mean, for me, I wasn't in the trial. It was an unrelated medication, but it provided some anxieties for me.
I was just going to say to the investigational agents, I know this is not geared towards that. We're talking about approved therapies, but it honestly is part of the conversation with every new diagnosis. You know, it's a ton of information to take in as a family, and like Aravindhan said, you know, we start with the genetics. What are we eligible for? And I at this point don't make a large distinction in terms of that information delivery if I think that a patient might benefit from a clinical trial. Now, obviously, we have to talk about the fact that this is research and this is not approved treatment, and making that distinction is very important. But to your point about exclusion criteria and you know, washout periods, those are considerations we have to address pretty early on if a family is considering taking a more investigational therapy approach.
I think one thing I want to emphasize is I think it is important to talk about these options, about the clinical trials in the clinic visits. So even if your provider is not talking about it, I encourage you guys to ask about, hey, are there any research that my child would be eligible for? Because the decisions that you're going to make that day in terms of changing medications or adding meds or stopping meds is going to, you know, it's going to be depending on your decision on if you want to be in a trial or not. Because it's, you know, it's a long day when you go for these visits, and we can easily lose that conversation about the research trials. And the other thing is also we have families like you who are all coming out and ask, you know, sometimes we know what we want, and there are families also, Duchenne is not their first problem. That is not their first challenge that they go through in their life. So I think when they come for the visits, I think it's extremely important for us to talk about these options and the risks, and making sure it is also, you know, making sure it's research. It's still, we're trying to figure out if this medicine is safe, if this medicine works or not.
I wish that our families that we care for in clinic were like the families that we have met here today. You are invested, you are educated, you understand, and you are really interested in all of the things that are approved and all of the things that are coming up the pipeline. For us, we take care of kids in safety net hospitals, so they do not have necessarily the opportunities to come here. So that conversation about clinical trial versus FDA, it goes a lot longer, a lot deeper, and a lot more repetition. And so that's some of the things that when we think about how we are guiding our patients to decide on clinical trial or an FDA-approved medication, we have to be very careful about.
And I also just do want to invite, if you have questions about any of these specific approved therapies, if you have questions for the clinicians just around considerations for you or your family or how you're thinking about this, please go up to, we have the 3 mics, feel free to go up to those and we will happily kind of address those questions. And in the meantime, I have more questions for the panel as well that we can continue to discuss. But I just want to make sure you all feel you have the time and space to ask those questions as well. Just kind of on that continuing around maybe the approved therapy clinical trial decision, you had any experience, because families might, sometimes you can, with the exception, we're going to take Elevidys off the table here since this is not a therapy that you can wash out of, with the other therapies where you could potentially have a washout period, so you stop taking the drug. Have you had any experience with families washing out and then how easy is it to get back on to those therapies that they maybe had approval, from their insurance on? Have there been any challenges on restarting a therapy if they've paused, just from that kind of, maybe experience?
I think, yes, washing out from, exon skipping or other therapies to get on a trial, yes, we have had experience, but then if you're on a trial, you're not allowed to go back on those drugs yet, so I think that's a challenge. Now, for commercial dosing, yes, we have had experience washing out, stopping the exon skipping, get on the microdystrophin, and then try to put them back on exon skipping agents. I think that's possible. It's a challenge with the payers, but I think we all, that is like a routine for us now to fighting with insurance companies, just like part of our life, everyday life.
Question down here in the middle.
Hi, thank you all. I know your work is really, really hard, and I appreciate that. We have an awesome care team. I also just want to say, prepping the parents for the struggle of the fight to the insurance is a really, really important part of the job. We got really excited when some of this stuff is approved, and my son is a good candidate for them, but it becomes, we got prescribed Duvizat in July of last year, and he went on it in February, and that was like a weekly struggle to fight and prove both on the parent and the provider side, and that's a heavy lift. That's a commitment for both of us, and I think prepping parents on that, it hasn't been easy to be like, hey, we aren't going to be this type of steroid family. We're going to go this way, and there is actual fighting and a network to change that, and that is really difficult. So I just want to say, appreciate that, and then I have one specific question for the cardiologist, which is, what are you looking for, if anything, in Duvizat? I know this is where it gets tricky, where families network, and they're like, well, my doctor is actually doing echocardio follow-up on Duvizat. My provider is not doing that. And I'm like, oh, am I missing something? Which may or may not be true, and this is where it gets really dangerous for parents to be in contact. While it's lovely that we all connect, it's also so many other comorbidities and other things that are happening for these kids, leaves me a little insecure if I'm missing something on the Duvizat front with cardiology. Yeah,
so from my standpoint, the approval is for skeletal muscle and not cardiac, but one of the characterizations is for 2 things cardiac related. If you want to consider triglycerides cardiac related, they sort of are in the greater scheme of things, but is changes in the electrocardiogram, so the EKG. But if you're followed regularly in clinic, our group is doing an EKG. You would have had an EKG before you started it, and then an EKG after you've been on it. And the period of time after that is probably variable amongst different people, but usually within weeks of starting the medication. And that's really to monitor the QT interval to see that it's not too long. If you're in a center that is following you, most of us are doing imaging on an every year basis anyway. So if you started a new medication, I do not necessarily image your heart differently than I would, because I'm doing it rather frequently anyway. And the other thing is, when, this is my approach, but when I see a drug or something approved in Duchenne, I then go and look in the literature and say, what do we know about this compound, this component in other disease states. And I know this is not public or published, but if you look in PubMed and other, there actually is some animal work in other disease models of adult heart attack and other things like that that may lend itself that Duvestat may have some benefit in the cardiomyopathy, but that wasn't particularly studied in the trial or so forth. So I think this is, again, I'll go back to Sam and plug DCRN because I am unaware of the company's plan to follow patients after they have been prescribed the medication. And so this is where an entity like the DCRN with other elements that are planned to go into that can do some of the real-world post-marketing analysis of the effects, and cardiac is one, because if you are getting cardiac MRIs every year and you had some element of fibrosis before you started the medication, and that was the only thing you changed, and the MRI parameters were improved, that's data that the world needs to know about. But if we as a community don't have a system in place to collect that post-marketing data and get it out, then we're left with this person does that, that person does this, and it's not consistent.
I just had a couple of things, Larry. I think thank you for making that point about the insurance. I think that's part of our discussions that happens because the time frame varies. That is important to make that understanding. But I think going a couple of points I just want to make sure is from the QTC standpoint, right? The QTC prolongation for Duvestat, they have not seen that in the clinical trials, but it is, we know as a group of HDAC, it can happen. So I think that's why we want to make sure that we have the EKGs. And then I think for most of the companies do have the patient assistance program. Again, that's not that's just a quick fix for make sure that you get on drug as soon as possible while we continue with that, the fighting with the insurance is something all of us should be aware of. And I do think ITF has plans to do a long-term post-marketing follow-up study to do the long-term follow-up of the patients that are getting on Duvestat. Those are some things I want to add.
Yeah, also, and I think there's some information in your booklet. There is an ex-US, so not here in the States, but there is a study of looking at Juvenistat, or Duvestat, sorry, in non-ambulatory patients kind of globally. Yeah. Right.
I wonder if Dr. Markham would clarify. So during a clinical trial, the restrictions about changing medications are in place for continuity, but in an instance where a patient is in decline, the clinical team is ethically required to make those changes. And if you don't recognize it until after the fact, that's one thing, but during the process, I'm certain that that's what's being done.
Yeah, and I probably wasn't clear. We were in the space of considering a preventive or proactive medication when there wasn't a clinical parameter or a change in the patient's condition to start a new therapy. So yeah, thank you.
I have one additional comment regarding insurance companies now. In light of these newly approved medications, and they're approved under different pathways, and it's more difficult for the ones that were approved under the accelerated approvals versus a traditional. And in many instances, particularly with commercial plans, you're now seeing them call out treating with different therapies when a previous one has been used. These are all exceptionally expensive therapies, so it's just something I'm sure that you're all having to deal with. It's quite an impediment for both the families and their treating clinical team.
I was going to say that's the favorite part of my job is dealing with insurance. Thanks for laughing. So, yeah, I think personally we can just make a quick side note on this. the strategies have been interesting, from the standpoint of how these drugs are initially denied, which is almost invariably the case. I've seen that there's been an evolution from some outright outdated or wrong information to, oh, well, yes, this was accelerated approval, or, oh, your patient falls outside of the trial, even though the approval was for a broader label. We're doing our best, and I really appreciate partnership with families when they recognize that the institution is on their side. And just go back to our keynote speaker, doctors are people too, and we want what's best for your kids.
Whenever we have trouble with insurance, it's a lot bigger than just the medical professionals, the medicine team. And that is why we connect with our institution team as well. They have people that take care of contracts, they have people that take care of those letters of agreement, and they have some leverage. For us, this is the one time that state Medicaid is very helpful, where I'm in California, and California tends to be a lot more forgiving when it comes to providing treatments for our patients with Duchenne.
And then, question over here on the right.
Thank you, and hello. The gentleman on the center right said that he believes that the FDA does a good job in approving drugs or taking drugs through phase 3. My question for any of you is this: now that we have Secretary Kennedy and Commissioner Macri aboard, what are the prospects for faster, less expensive development and approval of drugs, especially for rare disease drugs?
I wish I have an answer for you, but it's complicated in this right now.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I just hop in to say, I think this is part of, and Pat talked about this a little bit in our opening, that this is a moment for us where we do have to kind of do some relationship building and try to understand with the new leadership kind of what their outlook is going to be. I think at this moment, it is uncertain. We're not 100% positive, but I think this is where we come to you all and ask you to be, advocates, is to help build those relationships to make sure that leadership in any of the spaces of our government hear your voices and understand why this is important, so we can try to push them to make sure that things don't slow down for Duchenne, that we continue to drive the field forward, evaluate products, make sure they're safe and effective, and get them to you, as fast as possible. But it still is a little bit of an unknown at this stage, just with kind of how new I think some of the appointments are, but we hope to kind of build those relationships like we have in the past, and continue to make sure that this community is heard.
And lest I be up here as a FDA representative, which I'm not, I wanted to clarify. I think we have a process, and it's a strong process for drug approval. Whether we agree with all of the decisions that the FDA has made around therapeutics or not, I think from a Duchenne community, our emphasis rightly has been on the therapeutic pipeline and getting those drugs through approval. And I think we are finding ourselves in at least a transitional era where we need to think about real-world data. And now that we have these drugs approved, how do we use them? So that's really what I meant to highlight. I think we need to shift our mindset into improving the evidentiary standard around real-world data, combination treatments, these patients that don't fit the perfect inclusion criteria of a phase 3. How do these treatments affect those boys or those young men? And we don't really have a framework for doing that.
Thank you.
Down here in the center.
Hello. My name is Santosh, and maybe my question is straightforward. My son, he got gene therapy, and we are trying to, now that we have more therapies approved, we are trying to figure out which one we should take next, Duvyzat or maybe exon skipping. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on which one would be, which way we should take, or if there are any benefits versus risk between these two options.
And I think this is a very common question that a lot of families have who have received gene therapy, whether approved or through the investigational trials. Afterward, it is, we hear, we want to do something more, what is next and how do we get there? And I think, I'd love to hear your responses.
Sure. I think depending on, I assume that the gene therapy he's talking about is the commercially Elevidys, right? I think depending on what exon skipping are you talking about, right? So we have several in the approved exon skipping agents, but there are also several in the pipeline that are quote unquote, I call them second generation, but typically they're less frequent dosing, maybe a little bit better efficacy than, better effectiveness than what's currently approved. So depending on what exon skipping agent that your kid is eligible for, and depending on where they are in the pipeline, is it something that's going to get approved quicker, or is it something that you can get them on the trial for that? Depending on that options, then you would think about the exon skipping options. And then if I'm, let's say if I'm in the trial and so that, and then talk about do we set what we have in hand, what's the data right now, what is the safety versus the risk on that kind of stuff. I think if personally what I would do is if there is someone that's eligible for a exon skipping that is technically what we call second generation, because the ones that we have right now in the market, it's once a week infusion, and that's a lot for families to go through once a week infusion, especially in our state, they don't approve any home infusions. They have to come to our site to have once a week infusion. That is logistical challenge. It's a lot to go through for a family. So I think if there is something that's closer for that particular boy with that exon skipping that's in the pipeline with a less frequent dosing, then I'm recommending that. So let's do that. Or no, we don't want a clinical trial. We don't want to wait. Let's go to DuviSat. So that's how my discussions are.
I was just going to, again, make one more plug for DCRN. We're looking for use cases, and we can't answer every question on it for every patient at once, but this is a very common question. What do we do after gene therapy? And it's the perfect example, right? I think the short version, I don't want to paraphrase for Arvind, but we don't know which is the best next step. If we knew that information, I think all of us would love to be more forthcoming about it, but it's where we really need the data. And you're not unique. There's a lot of families in your position that want that next thing. And we need to find a way working together to get us that data that's going to give us the answer. Not a satisfying answer. It's a truthful answer.
If you get on both, I would try to get you on both because there's different mechanisms, right? I think if your insurance pay for it, we'll try to get on both.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
And I think maybe on that insurance thing, because that is a challenge, and even after you've received one of those therapies, to go and try to get an additional therapy can be a little bit of a fight. So for families who are maybe to the very first question of preparing for this, are there things that either families can do to be helpful to you all, or just expectation setting from their standpoint and in your experience of what this can sometimes look like?
So for us, for example, if we are going to go to gene transfer, we have a checklist. I think we do things very similar. We have a checklist so that our families know what it's going to look like when we're trying to get that approval. Especially with the commercial insurances, we're already asking families to write a heartfelt letter to your insurance company so that we have that when we submit it for a packet. And if you can provide pictures of how wonderful and happy and how integrated your child is, that actually helps us. It builds a case. Because people in the insurance company, even though we try to paint them in a bad picture, they are still people too. And once in a while, you can get that one person that is going to be your ally and push it through.
But they are paid to deny everything. That's what they're paid to do. I think the key thing that I think it's important is regarding gene therapy, right? Once you get an approval, that doesn't guarantee that you're going to get a drug. That doesn't mean anything. You get the insurance prior authorization approval. The most important process is right after that, right? So our hospitals have to work on the payment agreements with the insurance. That takes even longer. And I think setting that expectation upfront is important. And then sometimes we get the notices, the appeals or denials a little quicker than the family receive that sometimes. And then I don't want, they freak out when they get it. Hey, it's in denial. They denied it. What should we do next? Then, they usually call us and we tell them, okay, hey, we received it last week and we're working on it right now. So I think that's something always, if you receive any information, just talk to your the care team first before you freak out or anything about that. Because your care team might already be working on it.
Thanks. I think those are really helpful tips and just to help families, because sometimes hearing those things of, oh, here's the extra step I can be taking, I mean, that's great. Over here on the left.
Hi, I'm Ilaria from Parent Project Italy. So coming from Italy, of course, we have a completely different situation, and this is a conversation totally different from what I'm used to. So we don't have, we used to have one drug approved in Italy, not anymore. We don't have currently drugs approved in Italy. We do have 2 drugs approved in Europe, but still have to go in the process of approval in our country. On the upside, we don't have to deal with insurances because luckily we have a national health system. But my question for you is this, aren't you worried? I am worried, actually. Aren't you worried that with patients taking one drug on top of the other, changing drugs, washing out, and all of the things they are doing, of course, and I understand they are doing this, but aren't we all worried that we are not ever going to have real-world evidence to really understand what happens with each of these drugs in the long term? Thank you.
I'll say absolutely. I'm worried about that, and I think that speaks to the need to work together, because any one of our sites might have between 100 and 200, maybe a little bit more, patients with Duchenne, and we're large centers, and that's just simply speaking not a big enough sample size to get some of these questions answered, which speaks to the need to collaboration, and it's really an existential threat, I think, to our community if we can't do this. It's just something we have to do. We have to work together, aggregate data, and get some of these answers, because we're going to be doing the same panel discussion in 5 years if we don't do it.
I think one of the risks that probably is underappreciated is passing judgment on a potential therapy that could actually work, but if it's tried for a short period of time and then stopped and the data is not collected, there could be therapies that are deemed, well, this didn't work for me and so I'm stopping it, but maybe the benefit was actually longer term and we're actually not going to know. So you could potentially have an approved therapy that could work, but it falls by the wayside because of this switching and flipping and multiple therapies and things like that.
In the clinical practice that we have, the majority of the patients, they don't switch therapies all that often. So in our centers, they tend to stay on the medication that they're on. It's only a handful of our patients that will tend to switch. And so we probably do have that good data within our centers.
So I was going to say, I think we are here sort of, I don't want to, it's a biased group that we're hearing from here. The ones that we are seeing in our clinics, it's a completely different story. It's not, our majority of our families are hesitant to change therapies, add-on therapies, at least the ones that they follow with me, right? Most of them are. Because we are okay right now where we are, and we don't want to shake the boat and do anything to what's happening right now. So I think the other thing that you brought up is the access to care and the equity about the access to care. I think one, we still should have to be improved within the United States, and I also I think we have to consider those families who can't get these drugs, and outside of the U.S., the other countries that have nothing, even they struggle to get to just the standard of care visits and get that done. I think we have to keep those in mind as well, how fortunate we are right now in this point of time here.
Thanks. Then we'll take one last question over here.
In regards to the data sharing, I know that's great to advance the drugs, but also it's good for the kids too. Because my son, he's on a clinical trial, and then they want to put him on another trial, totally separate, but they want 2 different blood draws. If we can data share with one blood draw, it reduces the stress on the kids as well.
I completely agree, and I think we have some industry partners in here. They take that to their heart, and they work on it.
And absolutely, and I'll point out one more thing. I think when we start talking about collection of data and aggregation of data, we know this from other rare diseases, right? When we measure things, we do a better job as sites taking care of your patients. I think everybody's on their A game. We kind of move towards harmonization, even without doing rigorous statistical analyses on what we're collecting. We can kind of come together as a group and I think really move the field forward. So there's multiple kind of ancillary reasons to do this, but the discussion today has really highlighted, I think, why we need it.
Thank you. And so now I'm gonna invite Megan Fried from PPMD. Oh, okay, we'll do one more real quick, and then I'm gonna have Megan come up.
Just a quick one.
Yep.
So I'm just wondering, since there are so many drugs that are approved, I share the same thought with with what's happening in Italy, because we are from Sweden and Europe is a completely different case. So how are you thinking, there's no right or wrong obviously, but who is going to collect this data? Is it going to be the clinicians? Is it going to be the sponsors? Is it going to be the organizations? How is this data going to be collected? I'm thinking personally, this should be the interest of the sponsors to make sure that they run these kind of clinical trials and maybe get together with other sponsors and put combinations and do these kind of trials. That would be something I would think would be a good path to follow, but how does it work?
So I'm going to make a plug for, I think we have a 3 p.m. session that is addressing the DCRN.
I'm going to have Megan come and do that right now.
And we'll just let Megan answer the question.
And let me introduce Megan Fried with PPMD.
To your point about industry involvement, we absolutely value industry input here. I think it's a little bit maybe not in alignment with their goals in every case if we're talking about real-world evidence collection. I mean, they do these registries, but it's very difficult for an Intellipharmaco to work with a Sarepta if we're talking about combination treatments, and then this person's maybe doing exon skipping. I think the permutations that we get into with combination treatments put the onus back on the centers. And so we're talking about working together as care centers. And again, it's not a large number, but we're starting with a feasible number that's going to get us a kind of adequate sample size to start answering some of these basic questions, and then hopefully scale.
Okay.
Yeah, so we talked DCRN a few times, so I'm going to have Megan Fried come up and explain a little bit of what is the DCRN, what are some of our hopes for that.
Can we have one more question?
For time, Panda, I got it.
One more class. She's been standing there for a while.
All right, go ahead.
Just one last question. So my question is for the cardiologist. What is your recommendation for initiating heart protective medications for younger kids, and when do you consider, starting?
So if you look at the current guidelines, they suggest by age 10, and that was rather arbitrary. And that was from a decade ago. We had a meeting we had 2 meetings actually, one in Stanford and one in Washington, D.C., where a lot of us agreed that the evidence of benefit is far greater than the evidence for risk. And most of us agreed that if a family was interested and motivated, age 6 was probably fine and appropriate, as long as all parties agreed. But all of us acknowledge that there have been some families or some situations where he would prescribe medications even earlier. But I would say, if you ask me, my opinion is at age 6, I'm having a real conversation about medication. And then each year, I push a little bit harder. If you still said no before age 10, I am becoming more adamant that we have to do something.
Just a follow-up to that. So would you consider the changes in the echo or the MRI before you initiate that, or irrespective of the changes, would you?
Irrespective. Once you have changes on echo and MRI, you're getting the kitchen sink. And it's not a conversation anymore. It's, here are the 3 medications we're starting because your echo or MRI is abnormal, which has already put you in a different category. The first conversation was about everything is entirely normal. We're in a preventive, proactive mode. But once it is abnormal, all of us would agree that you're getting 2 or 3 medications.
Thank you.
Sure.
And then I'd like to thank all of our panelists for this great discussion.